Okay, here you go. So, good afternoon, everyone in France, and good morning to you, Ian, in California, right? I think you are at the moment. Okay. So, so welcome everyone to this seminar, discussion, conversation this afternoon. I'm inviting you to the IRCL, actually online, virtual seminar series online. So for those of you, because it's been, this conversation has been announced, of course, within the research center to which I belong, but also to sort of larger circles. So the IRCL is a joint research center, which is based in Montpellier, based in the University of Montpellier 3, but it's also attached to the CNRS in France. And the research center focuses on the period, so going from the 16th to the 18th century, mainly. And the center gathers historians and literary scholars in French and English studies, and so mainly literature and history, but also in musicology. So it is my honor today to be in conversation with you, Ian Coller, and I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly. Yes, perfect. So Ian, thank you so much for responding positively to my invitation and for being with us. So in what I believe, it's early morning for you. So just a couple of words of introduction, and then we will start the conversation together. So Ian Coller is a professor of history at the University of California, Irvine. And so your first book is entitled Arab France, Islam and the Making of Modern Europe, 1798, 1831. Which is kind of interesting because this was a book you published 10 years ago or so. And so it starts at the date where you stop your, like the book we are going to look at today, 98. So this book won the Australian Historical Association's W.K. Hancock Award, and your new monograph, Muslims and Citizens, Islam, Politics, and the French Revolution, was published by Yale University Press in 2020. And you are currently working on a new project related to race, whiteness, and masculinity in the early 19th century. So, like I said, this is going to be a conversation. We're going to have a round about into your book, Muslims and Citizens. I have prepared a set of questions. We'll see, like I said, how far we go with them. We're probably going to be in a discussion for about an hour. For those of you who are attending this seminar and who have read the book or who have questions about the conversation we're having, I'd be very happy to take these questions at the end. So if you want to type them in the chat box, for instance, and I'll take them for you. So let us delve straight into your book, dear Ian. So just for our audience who may not have read it yet, Muslims and Citizens so investigates the relation of Islam and Muslims to the French Revolution and the presence of Islam in late 18th century France. So it does so by examining how French revolutionaries used Muslims and Islam as test cases, for their own universal ideals. And by unpacking the economic, diplomatic, political, military, intellectual, and religious role of Islam and Muslims in the French Revolution during these revolutionary years, so from the fall of the Ancien Régime to Bonaparte's invasion of Egypt. So you're producing a book that sort of unpacks these questions. So first of all, my first question for you is, can you tell us more about how the idea of your book came about, where it came from, and also how it takes from your previous monograph, Arab France, Islam, and the Making of Modern Europe, 1798, 1831.
Well, thanks, Claire, and thank you so much for this invitation. It's actually wonderful to have a chance to speak about the book, particularly in France. I do hope that it will be available sometime soon in French. But yeah, I guess the book came out of two connected kind of impulses. One was just my own fascination. At the end of the previous project, I was working on a small exhibition that we were putting together called Performing Revolution at the University of Melbourne, where I was. And one of the organizers, I was still a grad student at that point, and one of the organizers got sick. And so I was allowed to go and look in the back room of the library and the archives. And I was trying to find images, and I came across these pamphlets in the collection of revolutionary pamphlets that the University of Melbourne held, which included this dialogue between Municipal and Ibrahim Pasha, and also another one in which Mirabeau was sent as a kind of monster in captivity to Morocco. At the same time, I came across a reference to this deputation of 1790 that included apparently Arabs, Syrians, Chaldeans, and so on. And I started to feel like there was something there that I hadn't really credited in relation to the French Revolution and looking back from my previous book. The second thing was that in a number of the reviews of my first book, questions were, I think, legitimately raised about the reference to Islam in the subtitle, given that most of those who I was talking about were, in fact, and certainly the most prominent amongst this first kind of Arab diaspora in France, were Christians of various denominations. I still think that Islam has to be understood as a space, not just as a religion. And it is a complex culture and from which these people came, but it still did push me to think more about Muslims and why Muslims didn't really figure so strongly in the ways of organizing and understanding this first kind of Arab migration. And I started to look back. I did some work with a group in France, actually, that was organized by Jocelyne Dachlia at the EHESS, and it's a wonderful group of people working on the Mediterranean, and that really pushed me, and her work too really pushed me to think more about how Muslims figured in this story. But then I really began to see that story also stretched back to the revolution and even prior to the revolution. So, then it's really, I guess, the fascination with the French Revolution itself, which is does exert a fascination that kind of never ends. So those are the kind of converging threads that really gave rise to this book.
Interesting. Yeah. Thank you. So we're going to come back to the question of chronology, but since you mentioned the you're being in Melbourne and looking at the archive, this is something I really wanted to sort of give our audience a sense of, because this was one of the not the most striking element, but really a striking element, a wonderful element of your book, is the amount of archives you've been looking into. And when I talk about archive, I talk about not only the National Archives in Paris, but also the National Overseas Archives at Aix-en-Provence, the Diplomatic Archives in Nantes, and also a legion of departmental and municipal archives. To name but a few, Marseille, Toulon, Rouen, Strasbourg, Montpellier as well. So with that, you were able to retrace the material presence of Muslims during the revolutionary years in France, and this is the first time I'm honestly seeing that. That very sort of material presence, so how they responded to also these revolutionary years, but also where and how they featured in administrative and official papers. So I wonder if you could tell us more about this work of yours in the archive. How did you proceed? What were your leads? And perhaps also more personally, so how gratifying and or how frustrating this could have been. Yeah. So because so for various for obvious reasons, the Muslim the Muslim individuals you're looking at um, did not produce the type of diplomatic trace that ambassadors would, or you're looking really at not anonymous because they have a name in the documents, but otherwise they're kind of normally unseen, in the big national or like big historical narratives. So yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it this really was a kind of obsessive detective story, of
Mm.
just kind of pursuing every possible lead that I could. I'm not sure that it would have been possible in quite the same way without what's available now through the internet and the searchability of the materials, in Google Books in particular, also on Gallica. It is incredible how much it is now possible to kind of reconnect these scattered fragments. At the same time, the old style of searching through boxes of documents is still absolutely crucial. You cannot, I mean, it's not possible to do this simply online. You have to go and search through the boxes because there are things in those boxes that have never been cataloged, that are surprising, that speak back to you. And this is, to me, really crucial to what the historian does, is to allow those archives to actually speak back to you. Just, I guess, to give one example, uh, I found a box of, I mean, very rarely in this process was there ever a specific corpus, as you might say in French, as there was in my first book. In the first book, I found these 12 boxes of documents at Vincennes, in the archives of the army, that were just dossier after dossier on the population that I was talking about. There is nothing like that when it comes to the revolutionary period for Muslims. But what I did find was this extraordinary kind of moment in 1799 when Muslims, first of all, Muslims and Ottoman subjects, but then specifically Algerians and Tunisians, were ordered to be placed under arrest. And so this kind of inquiry was sent to all the départements right across France, with this kind of, first of all, this extraordinary kind of sense that there were going to be these Muslims and Algerians and Tunisians living in the Sarthe, or the, in the Hérault. And in most instances, they replied saying that there wasn't anyone living in the department. But this, in amongst those documents was this one kind of precious document in which in the Seine-et-Marne, in which the commissioner replies saying, well, there are no Algerians and Tunisians, but there is a Muslim, but he has become a citizen of France. And it is so, I mean, there is no reason, according to the logic of the French Revolution, there is no other reason for anyone to be recorded as being a Muslim when they become a citizen. This was not one of the categories or the questions that was asked of people when they became citizens. So it's just only in this one instance, buried there somewhere in this box of documents, that we find just the kind of hard proof that this path was indeed possible. And it's so it's a kind of a combination. It means doing this search online, but then going to the boxes and seeing what happens and how they then speak back to me as a historian.
Yeah, I think so. You're referring to that 1799 moment, right? When because Bonaparte invaded Egypt, and so the Ottoman replies, or Ottoman the Porte replies, and declares jihad, and then all sort of Algerians or Moroccans are searched in France, and but presumably in order to sort of take them as prisoner. What was it? Was it the?
I mean, that was really a kind of reciprocal act, in the sense that the North Africa, I mean, the Europeans considered North African regencies to be effectively autonomous and independent of the Ottoman Porte, but that was not the case. And so when the Ottomans declare jihad against France after this completely illegal and unprovoked attack on Egypt, these regencies have to respond in some way, and they do so by placing French subjects under arrest. And so France responds by placing all Muslims, first of all Muslims, but then specifically Algerians and Tunisians under arrest. So this is this is precisely what revolutionaries did not do. And so it's a rupture with the basis of the revolution, which is this kind of reciprocal acts of kind of rupture of the rights of citizens or of others residing in France. These Muslims were to be placed under arrest regardless of whether they were citizens or not.
So do we know what happened to this man, to this Muslim citizen of France? Do we know if he was?
Look, I went to the Seine-et-Marne, and this is the other side of the archives, which is, other than this one mention of him at this point, and the research that I've been able to do to try to understand how he got there, there really is no further information on him. At the same time, and we can maybe talk about this more later, but that research and going into those archives to search in vain for the traces of this man led me to get a very, very different conception of what was actually happening on the ground in these rural areas of France during the revolution. And that's another part of the work that I'm doing now. We see a much greater level of diversity in those villages than I had imagined.
Okay, so maybe maybe I'll come back to this point, towards the end of our conversation. But so to go back to your book, I think I want, so at the beginning of your book, you write something which caught my attention. So I'm just going to sort of quote this line from you. So you're right. This book tells the story of how the vision of an essential compatibility with Islam emerged in the revolutionary imagination and came to be so dominant that 50,000 French troops were ultimately lured across the Mediterranean by its global promise, the global promise of the revolution. So this idea was not cut from the whole cloth in 1798. Its threads stretched back to 1789 and even earlier, and were intimately woven into the revolutionary transformation from the outset. So now, of course, the idea of essential compatibility resonates vigorously in our day and age, and reminds us very vividly, how questions of compatibility, incompatibility are the products of historical construction. But so to move to my question, I was wondering if you could tell us more about, if you could explain a bit more about the timeline that you chose, and why, instead of taking 1798 and moving forward into colonization, so a la Said, you took 1798, but moved backward to 1789. So, what did this gesture of moving backward in time allow you to see?
So absolutely, obviously, I am conscious of these debates in France when I talk about this essential compatibility.
Mm.
Um, and my point is not to argue that there is an essential compatibility, but rather, as you suggest, to historicize this conception, and to see the ways in which it formed a part of the kind of internal politics of the revolution, just as it does today form a part of the internal politics of France, and really has very little to do with Muslims. And that these imaginings can have really fatal consequences for people's lives and their well-being. In this instance, the invasion of Egypt was absolutely brutal and extremely violent.
Mm.
You know, Jacques Olivier Boudon recently wrote a book on the Egyptian campaign, and he does recognize in it, I think, you know, he's a Napoleonic specialist, but I think it's really important that he's recognizing the immense violence, the sexual violence, of landing 50,000 men in a country so far away from France, who are then there for 3 years. So, I mean, these are real. I mean, the destruction, the rupture that is produced by this is a real question. And yes, it is. Said definitely saw this as the sudden kind of descent of a particular version of modernization, kind of fully packaged, arriving in Egypt, and that it's kind of emerged out of this kind of long-term history and discursive construction of the Orient. I don't see it as being so fully formed. I see it as much more chaotic and haphazard, in the sense that they really, you know, I do take seriously this idea that they somehow believed that they were going to be welcomed with open arms. Otherwise, why this utterly ludicrous strategy? The strategy of moving through Egypt to India, which then suddenly changed when Bonaparte realized that was never going to happen. You know, having lost his entire fleet, that he would now march on Constantinople and, you know, re-enter Europe from the other side. And as much as, you know, Bonaparte had won some audacious victories in Italy, this, I find it hard to believe that this really could be considered good military strategy. I mean, it was completely, incredibly poorly planned and badly thought out. Yes, there was victories against the Mamluk armies, partly just because of surprise, but ultimately it was a total and complete failure. The great success of the Egyptian campaign was a propaganda success, was somehow repackaging this complete and disastrous failure as some kind of cultural victory. And I think that's, you know, that's where it is important in the narrative that Said is telling, in terms of the ways in which it is later understood. But I don't think that Said's account of that period itself is a very accurate one, in the sense that he sees it in this kind of longer term kind of shift from the Enlightenment through to kind of modern Orientalism, but he kind of leaves in place these events that kind of structure the European way of seeing. And in that, I guess I've been more influenced by people like Dipesh Chakrabarty or Christopher Bailey, or even someone like very important like Michel Rolf-Trouillot, who have really destabilized our understanding of what European history is as well, rather than simply looking at the way in which kind of Europeans construct the Orient. So I think that's in part then what led me back to thinking about why the French believed that they could succeed in Egypt.
Yeah. So you talk about propaganda, which is so interesting. You're talking, I presume, propaganda towards the French themselves, and the soldiers, and how you take 50,000 men across the Mediterranean. There is this very, I mean, I open your book and first, page you read, page one, introduction, first paragraph. You mention a brochure which was printed in Arabic. I was not aware of this brochure, so which is why also I'm mentioning it now. A brochure printed in Arabic, addressed to the people of Egypt. So written by Bonaparte, translated into Arabic. And so the brochure starts with, the pamphlet starts with the Basmala. So presumably Bonaparte uttering the Bismillah and declaring the French as quote unquote sincere Muslims. So there's, I mean, you quote the whole pamphlet, or I was reading that and I was thinking, I mean, who listened to this call, to open the country, to open Egypt to the French? And I mean, if the propaganda worked for French soldiers, do you? I can't remember really you focusing on this in your books, and this is why I'm also wondering if this is a question that also came to you later on. But how did the Egyptian officials, scholars, or uh, politicians, I mean, how did they react to this very strange basmala from Bonaparte before the whole thing becomes like a real bloodshed? I mean,
No, absolutely. And look, I think if this book has a clear relationship to my first book, I think there's probably a third part of this trilogy that has to be written at some point, which is about Egypt itself and going more deeply into what happened in this period. This book really, even though it starts in 1798, it really only goes up to 1797 in detail. My final chapter is really about Bonaparte himself, and provocatively titled Bonaparte's Burqa. Just because there does happen to be this story by the young Bonaparte about this prophet called Burqai, which is effectively the same word, and this kind of fascination with these kinds of masks and how it's possible to use religion to achieve power by exploiting it in a kind of cynical fashion. At the same time, Bonaparte in this period, just like so many other revolutionaries, does not have a fixed view about religion. He doesn't know what he wants to do with religion. Religion has structured French life for, all the existence of France, the whole of the rhythms and the I mean, and much even more so for Bonaparte coming from Corsica, right? I mean, it's kind of French Catholicism, Italian Catholicism, this deep family structure that's connected to these ways of thinking. And yet that has all been completely transformed to the point in 1794 of the virtual abolition of religion entirely from France, or the attempt in 1794 and afterwards to create new kinds of religions. I mean, to invent a new religion that would be more rational and a deism, which is then often, in this kind of bricolage that they're trying to assemble some sense of what a new religion could be. Islam comes up in new ways in that period, and Bonaparte is carrying with him the legacy of that process and that confusion about religion. And I guess this is one key point at which some specialists on the Middle East and on this period might disagree with me. They take Bonaparte's later interpretation of his actions at face value, and they say that he later says that it was all cynical and that he knew exactly what he was doing. My sense from this document is that he had no idea what he was doing. My point is not that he believed that the French were Muslims, but that he somehow must have believed that the Egyptians would believe that the French were Muslims. Otherwise, why bother saying it? I mean, it just seems so utterly ludicrous to present yourselves as liars right from the outset. So I think there was clearly some kind of sense for Bonaparte, but for others too, in this French invasion, who did believe that there was some, were carrying the legacy of this belief in an essential compatibility. One of the generals, one of the key generals, and the key who will later take over as the leader of the French in Egypt, General Menou, converts to Islam in order to marry a local woman, but also as part, I mean, this is also sponsored by Bonaparte. Bonaparte starts off by wearing Muslim clothing until he realizes how ridiculous he looks and goes back to wearing. But, throughout there is this attempt to kind of enforce the kind of realization of this vision. And I think that is there kind of visually when you look at that document.
Okay. It's sort of, gives a more, I guess, complex and nuanced understanding of what was happening, when they arrived, when 1798, because you can look at that through that invasion through the lens of geopolitics only, and think they were trying sort of to whitewash their invasion into a kind of protection of Muslim land, when all they were after was the Suez Canal and access to and blocking so the British Navy from accessing the trading routes towards India. But looking at these documents,
well, yes, they did. I mean, they wanted to build a canal, right? The canal doesn't exist until under Napoleon III. But they certainly investigated building a canal. They ultimately they believed that, in fact, the Red Sea was at a different elevation from the Mediterranean, and so they would end up flooding the Mediterranean if they dug a canal, which was an incorrect calculation. But you asked also, let me just quickly say that you asked also about what was the reception of this in Egypt. And obviously, right, I mean, the Egyptians were not fooled in any sense by thinking that the French were Muslims. At the same time, there were those. So someone like Jabarti, the great historian of this period, really makes fun of these French claims. At the same time, again, he's doing that at a time when the Ottoman power has been reestablished. So there are reasons why he would not really be expressing any kind of, plausibility of these claims. At the same time, we have a text by Attar, who is the teacher of the famous Tahtawi, who expresses his a different kind of view of the French, and this fascination by the fact that some of the French spoke Arabic and that they were appreciators of Arabic poetry. We had other people who joined the Diwan in Egypt who I mean, the reality was that Egypt was ruled by foreigners already. The Mamluks, even though in the 18th century they had become much more kind of indigenously kind of placed in terms of their positioning, they still appeared to many Egyptians as a kind of external caste. And the Ottomans too. I mean, the Ottomans spoke a different language, and even though they were Muslim, their claims were not always understood in the same way by Egyptians. So there certainly was, there was a party within Egypt. And this is in part what gives rise to the emigration that then that I talked about in my first book. Those people who actually do take quite seriously the promises of the revolution, of freedom, equality, a new kind of society, and they want independence for Egypt. And that is the original project, for them to leave and go to France. When they arrive in France, they discover France is not interested in sponsoring independence of anyone anymore. This is now the consulate, soon will become the empire. This is not the revolution. So
True. So there was another aspect of your book that I wanted to return to with you, which I found very stimulating. So that was to think about the question of geography. So let me explain. I think so. Your book constitute a form of decentering narrative, decentering work in the historiography of the French Revolution, the Republic, and the Enlightenment. Because so not only by focusing on Islam and by focusing, sorry, on Islam and the Maghreb, you redraw the map of the revolution and shift. There is a shift, happening. A shift away from the established narrative of a transatlantic transfer of ideas and ideals through a trans-Mediterranean form of exchange. And so I emphasize here the word exchange. Exchange, inspired by a phrase in your book, which said that Muslims were not passive recipients of these ideals, or the passive recipients of the damages of the revolution, but that they were, and I quote, good or necessary to think with. And so, in that regard, how would you say that your research disrupt this sort of diffusionist and universal narrative of the French Enlightenment? And how does this sort of trans-Mediterranean and Muslim component of that history change the rule of this sort of diffusionist game?
yeah, I guess there was a really important displacement of that diffusionist idea back in the I guess the 1950s and 1960s with Robert Palmer's work. Robert Palmer and Jacques Godchaux working on the Atlantic. And Palmer at that time really began to look at the French Revolution as part of this wider democratic revolution, which was very much focused on the Atlantic. That vision didn't really take into account the Caribbean revolutions and the importance of the Haitian Revolution in particular. And that was a kind of absence that was later filled by brilliant historians like Paul Gilroy in the Black Atlantic, for example. And there's been a huge renaissance of work in that area. So that's been on race and slavery and the Haitian Revolution in particular over the last 10, 15 years.
Mhm.
But we haven't really moved beyond that sense that this was in some sense a kind of Western revolution. This is how Palmer put it, that it was a world revolution of the West, and that the world revolution of the non-West, as he called it, had to wait for 200 years to happen.
Mm.
So this reinforces this kind of narrative. Ultimately, even though his picture is not a kind of diffusionist one, it's actually a kind of big agitation one, right? But his big agitation still is embedded in a diffusionist conception of what relation Africa and Asia have to to Europe and the Atlantic. Perhaps because I come from Australia, and so I'm not really part of any kind of Atlantic. The Maybe that's helped give me a different kind of perspective, but certainly North Africa is so much closer to Europe than than North America is.
Mhm.
Algiers is the same distance geographically from Marseille as Paris is,
Mm.
right? This is going to shape France and shape Algeria and shape all of North Africa in the century to come. And yet somehow during the period of the French Revolution, we imagine that it's just a complete absence, that there is no relationship or no connection. And that, I think, reinforces the kind of colonial narrative in some sense, this idea that underpinned colonialism, that Africa was somehow backward and needed to be dragged into modernity by European intervention, when in fact quite the reverse was what took place.
Mm.
So yes, bringing those kind of the self-evident presence. W.E.B. Du Bois wrote, I mean, I think I mentioned this in the book, that W.E.B. Du Bois wrote a brilliant article called Africa and the French Revolution, in which he imagined asking a colleague what was the relationship between Africa and the revolution, and the colleague just looking at him pityingly and saying that although they might admit that Africa and the French Revolution actually somehow existed in the same space at the same time, that there was no other relationship between them. This was before the work and the kind of extremely important shift of consciousness about the role that slavery and race played in the revolution. But I wanted to take that, I guess, more fully. He said Africa and the French Revolution, not slavery and the French Revolution. So that question of Africa, and also now Asia, we have colleagues like Sujit Shivasundaram at Cambridge, who's published a book on these questions about the kind of hinge between revolution and empire in Asia in this period. So this is, I mean, and Christopher Bailey's work, of course, as well, was absolutely crucial for me in kind of opening up that set of geographical questions. His chapter, his relatively short chapter on these kind of revolutionary waves and recognizing the significance of this revolutionary moment in South Asia in particular, but right across East Asia as well. I think that we start to conceive of the ways in which kind of global history was shifting in this moment, and that gives the context in which the French Revolution takes place and takes the importance that it does.
Mm. Okay. Um, you've mentioned so we've discussed Egypt, and the Mediterranean. Now, there is another part of your book where you focus on Algiers. And so I'd like to sort of look at that, the situation in Algiers, where you say that you talk about the political and intellectual reception of the French Revolution. And again, by going into sort of details, you kind of unpack the I guess also hesitations, as to how to make sense of what was happening in France at the moment. And so you talk of first of a moral and material support uh, of the day of Algiers, when at the moment when the whole of Europe had turned actually against turned the back against France, so around 1793. But you also register at the same time anxieties amongst the Algerian political and religious elite or leaders concerning the importation of fitna, so disorder, and also another term that mentioned from them is fauda, so anarchy. Um, so I wonder. I mean, then how do you so how do we make sense of this hesitation? So that is recognizing the revolution as a fitna, but at the same time providing material support to revolutionary France. That was something that puzzled me as a reader of
Yeah, I
your book.
think the relationship of Algiers to the revolution is really complex. And the day Hassan is a little bit of an enigma, I have to say, to me. Maybe that's just something I need to pursue further. I find him very, very interesting. He went so far out of his way to support the revolution that he even lent significant sums to French merchants who could not purchase the grain that they needed from Algeria because of the assignat, right? I mean, that there isn't enough currency in France, and so he lends them currency, and it's those debts that will ultimately form the basis for this incident in 1827 that will lead to France's invasion, or become the pretext for France's invasion in 1830, and for this long and extremely destructive occupation that will continue for 130 years afterwards. So this is it's a really, really crucial moment. And it's really important to recognize that North Africa, there's a great book by Lucette Valency called, Prelude to Conquest, like on the eve of the conquest. And that is how the 18th century has often been considered in North African history, as, it's not really the favorite subject for North African historians in general, with some exceptions. But in fact, the revolutionary period in North Africa was enormously, enormously turbulent and significant. This is the point at which Algeria really comes into being. The Spanish, and in part as a result of the French Revolution, withdraw from Oran. And that then, this had been one of the underlying fundamental issues for the structure of Algiers and its dependencies. So that now that you have Oran, Constantine, and Algiers all under the same kind of loose structure, you have the basis for what will become modern Algeria. And there's a real consciousness of that. This is hugely important and significant, what has happened in 1791 as this new day comes into power. in a peaceful transition of power, which is not something that was happening earlier in the 18th century. So things have really fundamentally shifted across this period. And so they are looking to establish with their closest neighbors. There's a lot of problems with their neighbors in North Africa. So evidently they're looking across the Mediterranean. Spain had been the traditional adversary. France had been a traditional ally. And so these new possibilities and this new kind of push for the creation of some kind of modern state is really kind of, I think, evident in this moment. And I think it's really important to recognize that to shift this conception that somehow Algiers was some kind of collapsing and decadent society that was invaded by easily invaded by France in 1830. That's not at all the kind of conception that we need to have of North Africa in this period. And so kind of restoring these, and then this question of fitna and fauda, I think we have to be careful in just assuming that those are negative terms. And I have a student who's currently working on the kind of circulation of this idea of fitna, and what fitna meant. Fitna was also used to describe the kind of revolutionary changes taking place in the Arabian Peninsula with Wahhabism, for example. And fauda was used later on just as a kind of neutral term to describe the republic. Anarchy, but not anarchy in the way that we, since the late 19th century, consider anarchy to be a kind of a terrible term. Anarchy at that point did not have this kind of powerful negative connotation that we would attribute to it. And so, it just means there is not one ruler. It's the opposite of monarchy in that sense. And so it's a word that is sometimes used interchangeably with republic, which will later become jumhuriya. But this is not necessarily the word that is used to describe republic at that time. So, some linguistic, this is, I guess, for real kind of linguistic specialists. And I think linguistic investigation in this period is a real kind of rich source of thinking. This is something that's been done in thinking about Saint-Domingue and the Angolans, the people from the Kingdom of Congo in Saint-Domingue, and how they imported certain terms that become part of the Creole. I have a student who's working on Arabic and South Asian languages and the kind of circulations of words like fitna in this period and how that is actually changing. I mean, this is also a period in which the term revolution changes in meaning. The word democracy changes in meaning. So, I mean, all of these words are in flux during this period.
Yeah, absolutely. As they always are. And like you said, it's so crucial to go back to the philology and to go back to the contextualization and localization of the concepts that are being used. So thank you for that. Actually, I didn't know about the fitna and Wahhabism, and but there's definitely more to understand from a very sort of detailed analysis of the terms and the kind of concept they circulate, that are circulated through them. Um, yeah, I wanted to point also another important, or I think important aspect in your book, which is that to me, it seems that you are both. Okay, I'm not. I should have said it perhaps at the beginning, but I'm not an historian myself. So I'm inviting you as an historian, but I'm like by profession more of a literary scholar, to be more specific. But I still sort of look at your book from a perspective. So where I work on Orientalism, and a lot has been said, about this whole idea of representation and sort of. So you have historians looking at that, at how, like the history of ideas, basically, to but there's also, and there is on the other hand the material history. And when I was reading your book, what I really particularly enjoyed, even as a reader, was that you were really able to navigate between the two. You were sort of bringing the best of these two historiographical trends or directions or together into one book. And I think this is well, really, that really made also your book so interesting, that it was not just material history and not just a history of ideas. And so one aspect of your book, we've been discussing the material aspect, there's also a lot of um, sort of deep discussions about how Muslims were represented and for what political purposes. You have Robespierre, I think, represented as Mahomet at some point, and many other passages in your book which refer to the stereotypes and the political uses of stereotypes. So I wondered if you had something to say about that, about your intention in terms of methodology and also in terms of the use of stereotypes, in against Muslims against or for Muslims, in these revolutionary years.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this you strike there, I guess, at the kind of intellectual heart of the project. That really was the most difficult thing, and the one that I felt most passionate about, which was that it was neither going to be simply a book about how French people represented Muslims, nor just an anthology of all the traces of Muslims that I could find in France in this period, but rather an investigation of the intersection between discourses and bodies, between the ways in which Muslims were represented and how Muslims themselves lived and experienced those discursive constructions and how they shaped them too.
Mm-hmm.
That the danger, I think, often with the kind of discursive analysis is that it treats the objects of that analysis as completely passive and lacking in agency in any historical sense. And I guess what I wanted to trace and what excited me the most was to find those traces of action. I mean, even to the point of seeing in the 1780s how Muslims, these tiny numbers of Muslims in France, nonetheless sought to act politically in terms of reclaiming this tiny space in Marseille that was designated to them as a burial site, as a a place to organize their burials. This was a legacy of slavery, in fact, of the enslavement of Muslims in Europe as a result of this kind of long-term religious war and the use of those purchase and use of those enslaved Muslims in the arsenal in Marseille and later in Toulon. But to see how this kind of shifted in the 1780s, to me, is really fascinating. And those actions, and this is so clear, I think, at the beginning of 1789, how those actions begin to shape the politics of France's relationship with Islam in this time. One of the key figures that I talk about in that first chapter is Ishaq Bey, who's an Ottoman kind of aristocrat, I guess we could call him, who's present in France across this period. And we just find multiple traces of this kind of interest in and interaction with him, and how much those kind of discursive framings are shifted by the presence of Muslims. At the same time, there is also a kind of, I mean, it is not to deny that there is a discursive weight, that there is a kind of, there is often a resort to these, a whole repertoire of Orientalist tropes that exist, and that can be reactivated under certain conditions. I just don't think that the Orientalist tropes are quite as organized or as kind of unidirectional as I guess Said would suggest. I think there are, and people like Thomas Kaiser had kind of shown this already, that the argument about despotism was being used, Oriental despotism was being used in really kind of complex ways within French politics. And I mean, I guess to kind of leap ahead, and again, we can talk about this later, perhaps, but I see the same kind of processes in place today, right? The ways in which Islamophobic discursive constructions and Islamophilic discursive constructions are being kind of used and manipulated for political purposes, and the ways in which, and the kind of questions then that arise for me about how do Muslims exist and navigate within those kind of discursive frameworks and shift those discursive frameworks.
Absolutely. So, I mean, there are many other aspects of your book which I would have sort of loved to sort of discuss, but I'm looking at my clock at the same time, and so perhaps I because you also mentioned, contemporary contemporary situation and issues. I will probably, ask you one final question that sort of relates with today, because you open your book actually with a reflection on the Arab revolutions of 2018, 2011, sorry, and beyond, ongoing. So I'm just going to quote actually a page in your book. If I can, yeah, it's just the very beginning. So it goes in 2011, a wave of revolutions began in Tunisia and grew in force until it toppled dictatorships in Tunis, Cairo, and Tripoli, shook regimes in Bahrain, Yemen, Morocco, and Iran, and sent shockwaves across Africa, Asia, Europe, and the Americas. Some commentators rushed to dub this the Arab 1789, as though it had taken the Arab world more than 2 centuries to catch up with the West. When I visited Tunis in May 2011, it was clear that this was not a delayed sequel, but a seizing of historical agency in its own right. A revolution that set its own precedent and was at the same time part of a larger seismic wave. Instead of seeing Tunisia through the lens of 1789, I saw and felt the experience of the French Revolution anew through the lens of universal possibility that knew no frontier of category or nation. I wanted to ask a different question about 1789, seeing seeing it not as a matrix for thinking about later revolutions, but rather as a simultaneous historical experience. It is a self evident proposition that Muslims were part of the world of the French Revolution, yet that simultaneity has proven almost impossible for many historians to imagine, i.e., the Muslim world, quote unquote, the Muslim world, they insist, existed in a different temporality altogether. So that resonates in so many, different ways about the contemporary situation, also in France. So your book was published in 2020. And I do know, I do not know, sorry, if there is a translation in the making, but obviously it critically resonates not only with the perpetual Muslim question in France and its compatibility with modernity, freedom, enlightenment, and the values of the French Republic, but also with the so-called separatism of Islam. So for me, your monograph was also one of the best responses that research can produce against this nauseous, really, and dangerous political agenda. So that was my reading, kind of perhaps the political reading of your book. But I was so. Well, how does your book resonate now? Because this preface was, looking at 2011, now 2021. How does your book figure into that sort of different environment, perhaps? And maybe that takes us to your new research project. I don't know.
No, no, absolutely.
Mm.
I mean, I think that, yes, perhaps I would have said something different in the context. I have been shocked by the recent kind of manipulation of Islam. I guess I shouldn't be shocked in the sense that I've seen the long history of this. But the recent decision by key members of the French government to begin to fan this idea of Islamo-gauchism amongst, and accusing this kind of dangerous kind of connection apparently between Islamism and the academy, blaming then critical race theory and feminism and kind of all of these kind of progressive forces within the academy of somehow being some kind of betrayal of the values of the Republic. Mm. I think that does kind of recontextualize and give even greater importance to what it is, the need to go back and look at this history. We see that these conceptions of Islamo-gauchism you can see them in the French Revolution itself, coming from the extreme right. I mean, caricaturing Robespierre as Muhammad is actually kind of and this, you'll see this again with Napoleon. I'm actually writing about this at the moment. I mean, Napoleon is accused of being an Islamo-gauchist effectively by Chateaubriand. So, I mean, there's a long history of this gesture, of this kind of attempt, especially as politicians move to the right and seek a constituency on the right. Mm. This attempt to connect the left to some kind of fear of Islam has a long history. And yes, I think it is extremely disappointing to see that happening in a government that claims to be of the center. But again, it's not it's not really necessarily that surprising, and it's really important to recognize it in historical context. I do think that, again, the problem that we may face when we respond to these, this huge controversy about Islamo-gauchism is that the important question is the question about Muslims in France, not the question about whether, academics are being accused or kind of drawn up into internal politics of the French state. The real danger in the end is the danger for Muslims themselves, for ordinary Muslim citizens of France who need to be who have a right to difference, but also, I think, as a colleague of mine wrote, a right to indifference, right? Mm-hmm. To just be treated according to, as citizens of the Republic, and not for their religion to be imagined as essentially incompatible or essentially compatible with with the Republic, just like any other religion. Right, we have the same kinds of problematic histories that emerged at the end of the 19th and into the early and mid 20th century in relation to Judaism and the compatibility of Jews with the Republic became, the obsession of the, and it moved from the left to the right, from the late 19th into the 20th century. And so, we saw the horrific consequences of that kind of politics. And I do think we need to be on guard against that. In terms of the kind of more positive aspect of what I hoped my book might do, and I guess it's strange because I'm not French and I'm not writing in French, but in some sense that gives me a kind of liberty to to say things. This is one thing I will credit France for, I think, in a really positive sense, that French historians have been remarkably open to hearing from people outside of France on French history. That is actually that is a remarkable openness. I'm not sure that it's always the case with those in other histories. If Australian historians are not always willing to hear what French observers might have to say about their history, but one of the things that I think is so important in this is to find those plural possibilities in the history. That instead of trying to tell the Muslim students in schools, African students in schools, those of Southeast Asian background or like South Asian background in French schools, to tell them this is the history that you need to swallow. You need to take this. You need to become French. You need to take this history and make it your own, and forget your own history. Is to recognize that French history is world history. French history is plural and complex and has all of these elements in it. The diversity is not some new phenomenon that descended on France a few years ago. It is deeply intertwined with French history and needs, it offers really rich possibilities. To me, looking at Muslims in the French Revolution and the questions around Islam in the French Revolution wasn't just a kind of, fighting a battle against certain kinds of fixed ideas, but opening up new, rich ways of understanding the role of religion, the nature of the political culture, right? The significance of the French Revolution on a global scale also.
Absolutely. And your book, really looks into sort of details and moments where things we know are not clear. There are hesitations. Could have gone this way, went that way, and that sort of changed the whole narrative. But really, there was a possibility, to sort of it being very different. So this is really one important take in your book. Thank you so much, Ian, for this very fruitful discussion and for being, with us. It's early morning for you, and so I hope this also gives our audience an idea of what your book is about, and that it really gets into our classroom in France, and hopefully with a translation, because it really sort of changed many aspects of the in the narrative, which are a change which is much needed, including in French academia these days. So thank you again. I'm just going to look at I think there's just one comment in the box. So there is a comment on the it. I don't know exactly what it is. The French elite plays tag to create sort of. Yes, it's a question perhaps on. I don't think it's a question. It's more a comment of how we tag people, and that's sort of used into a jingoistic national agenda, or yeah. So there isn't any specific.
No, I would agree. I would agree with that. I mean, I would agree with that point, but it doesn't have to be necessarily a jingoistic national agenda. It's often, I mean, and look, my observation from outside it's just often an internal political calculation, which is about about the next election, right? And who you need to vote for you, and which parties. These are the kind of calculations. I don't view, for example, the French Revolution as a jingoistic national revolution, but politics were deeply, deeply entwined in, factional politics, personal politics. The work of Marissa Linton, for example, in Britain, has shown how these internal friendships and personal connections play into the way in which the revolution unfolds. So Muslims become drawn into that politics, but we have to be really, really careful and really, I guess, conscious and aware of that process, because it can have really terrible and violent effects in the long run if we're not conscious of how it's unfolding.
Of the threads, yeah, exactly. There is a question about your next book. Would it be France and Syria and Lebanon? La
um
de Levant.
that would definitely be really interesting. And I guess I will just hand that over to some of my students. I have a student, Steve Pascoe, who just finished his dissertation, and he will be publishing it soon, looking at the French mandate in Syria. So these are some new emerging historians who will be taking up and doing some of this work, I hope. As I said, Ayal Amer, who's another one of my students, is working on absolutely fascinating stuff about South Asia at the moment. And look, I would definitely encourage others who are interested. The one thing I would say is, I guess, again, as an Australian, perhaps I had a certain liberty to ask questions that people just raised their eyebrows about and looked at me as if I was completely crazy. What possible relationship could there be between the French Revolution and Islam? I would encourage young historians, and in particular those who bring with them a heritage that comes from North Africa, from the Middle East, and so on, to take that risk and be willing to ask these new questions, and France's history is ripe to be reinterpreted and rethought, right? It's very, very important. There are huge absences. This has happened in Britain with a whole kind of post-colonial generation of scholars who've done such incredibly important and brilliant work in rethinking British history. And in France, with all the amazing and brilliant historians that there are in France, there is still plenty to be done, and there is plenty for a new generation of scholars to do. So don't be afraid of Islam. Don't be afraid of critical race theory. Don't be afraid of feminism. These are actually incredibly rich, important, transformational ways of looking at history. And I think they are what is going to enrich our study in the future.
Yeah, absolutely. And working, jointly in terms of languages, in terms of archives, it's absolutely crucial. Absolutely. Yeah, so thank you for these sort of, stimulating venues that you are sort of opening for us. I've got like beautiful messages here on the chat box about, thanking you for your book and for this presentation. So I guess we'll sort of we're coming to a close. So I want to thank you once again. I'm just keeping an eye if there is any questions, but I don't think there is. Um, and um, and so yes, so thank you for your time with us. So again, Muslims and Citizens. It was published last year. and it's now available. It's in Montpellier. I've requested, it for our our university library,
Here it
but
is.
here it is. So yeah, thank you so much, Ian, and wonderful work. And I'm sort of wishing you all the best for the sort of future
Thank
project.
you all for attending. I really, I really appreciate it. And if there are any young historians who are interested in, reaching out and remaining in contact, then please, by all means, drop me a line. As I say, it's so important to be encouraging this next generation to be continuing with this work.
Agreed. So thank you
Thank
very
you
much.
again, Claire, for organizing and for the wonderful questions. Just show so much, careful reading. It's an incredible joy to be able to talk to someone who's read the book so carefully.
You're more than welcome. Thank you for writing it in the first place. Okay, so goodbye, everyone. I'm just going to end this meeting now. Goodbye, everyone. Thank you again. Goodbye.